The structure of today's hour, I am going to, after the welcome, introduce SteelWatch and why we exist as an organisation. Then I'll hand on to Margaret. If I could just introduce Margaret at this point so we don't interrupt the flow. Margaret's campaign lead with SteelWatch. There's Margaret. Margaret's based in the US. I'm based in the UK. We're part of the SteelWatch team. Margaret will look further into the report and why we think it is essential time, to phase out coal in steel production. We then have a wonderful panel with Dr. Reimann from Agora and Hilary from Industrious Labs, who I will introduce when we get to that point. They will give their reactions and then we'll turn to the Q&A. So that's our agenda for today. Without further ado, I will get going. That's the agenda we've just shared. So, introducing SteelWatch. We are here to bring climate urgency to steel. We focus only on the steel sector. As far as we know, we're the first international civil society organisation focusing exclusively on steel from a climate point of view. We're a climate campaign organisation. We're really campaigning on behalf of a stable climate. We are focused on transformation of the steel sector, not just a bit of change, which I'll come to more. And we're, importantly, an international organisation. We work with national and regional allies, but we need to play this change dynamic internationally. This is our vision. We are not anti-steel. We think steel is part of the future, but it needs to be part of a thriving zero emissions economy. So that's our aim, to influence the steel sector to become part of that. Our mission, therefore, is to turbocharge, to accelerate this transformation. And we do think it's a transformation. We don't think it's business as usual with a few bits of capture or reduction on it. It's a transformation to a steel sector that is decarbonised, and not only is decarbonised, but enables the environment, communities and workers to thrive. Our immediate priority is this side of 2030. We need the steel sector to get on track with a 1.5 degree warming trajectory, because as we're about to explain, it most definitely is not. So that's us. A few key facts about us before we go further. You can see the team here. We have one additional member who actually started today, based in Europe, who isn't on here yet. You can see 3 of the team are based in Japan. The rest of us are in Europe and the US. So as I say, we're international. And our timeline, the scoping of SteelWatch, was really last year. This year, we've been building the organisation. Our legal registration was just a couple of weeks ago. And here we are launching webinars and reports. So we have spent this year looking at what's happening in change in steel, and we've defined, for a starting point, our 3 roles in driving change. Our 3 roles being complementary to what everyone else is doing in this increasingly busy space, not yet crowded, but becoming more busy. Starting from the bottom of this slide, we want to drive ambition, and we want to challenge that narrative that, well, we're doing a bit better than last year, and therefore that's great. It is not great. From a climate point of view, it is just not enough. So we need to shine a light on the gaps. Second, we want to strengthen global advocacy wherever it's happening. We're not going to achieve change on our own. We will work with local, national and regional organisations that are working for an equitable and zero emission steel sector. And thirdly, we will have specific campaigns for corporate actions focusing on specific investment decisions, seeking actionable change company by company and plant by plant. So far, based on our analysis of change and who's doing what, that's how we want to contribute to raising the bar, driving ambition and driving action. Right, so why do we exist? Let's start with a Zoom poll. If you have already read our report, you might be excused from this. We all know the IPCC. IPCC set a carbon budget that gives us half a chance, or gave us when they wrote it, a 50% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, leaving aside the question of whether the last couple of weeks make that still feasible. As of January 2023, the remaining carbon budget for the entire planet, every industry, every household, every country, is 380 gigatons of CO2 between January 23 and 2050. So if we continue with business as usual, coal-based steel production, what percentage of this remaining carbon budget do you think will be used up? Let's see if we can launch the Zoom poll. This is a big challenge for a startup doing all this tech. Okay, what percentage of the remaining carbon budget for the entire planet will be used up by a business as usual approach to coal-based steel production? Business as usual means the stated policies that have been stated and analysed by the IEA. You've only got 3 options, so I'm not going to give you a very long time to answer. Put your answers in. Right, Caitlin, let's see how people have voted. Ah, very good. You have read the report already. For those of you who thought 7%, it is 7% of annual emissions, the steel sector, but it is going to gobble 23%, almost a quarter of the remaining carbon budget by 2050, if we stick with business as usual. That's just not feasible. I mean, it is not feasible for steel to eat a quarter and for everyone else to shrink their emissions to 3/4. So it means that 1.5 degrees is not feasible. So either the steel industry changes or we bust where we need to be. It's an unpleasant rock and a hard place. So moving on. There is our answer, 87 gigatons of CO2 from coal-based steel production, 23% of the budget. The 3 reasons then that we exist. The first one is, as I've said, the steel sector has a climate problem, but it's not just the steel sector has a climate problem. All of us have a climate problem because steel poses a climate risk to us all. And I'm really intrigued that people outside of steel don't know that. It's 7% of annual greenhouse gas emissions, the same as India's emissions, and the industrial sector with the fastest growing emissions. This graph, the left side, shows you the last 20 years and how fast those emissions have grown, actually doubled since 2000. The red line at the top shows you what will happen under this business as usual based on stated policies. You can see it's not even going down. What needs to be happening is steel sector emissions need to be going down at the pace of the orange line. At least that's the IEA net zero steel pathway. The steeper line is actually the IPCC calling for the whole planet to decarbonize in time. And as you can see, that is even steeper. So the 2 lines are just, well, the 3 lines are miles apart. And if we focus in on 2030, we can already see that by 2030, the gap is huge. This is not a case where we can just wait for technology to develop in some slow time. And we can look at the 2040s to change. Too late. By 2030, annual emissions from steel need to be more than a gigaton lower per year. So that gives us our marching orders. What's the next reason we exist is, well, there is change. It is a really exciting space, actually. There's a lot of change almost every day, but it's too slow. It's too small. On the positive side, we've got the first commercial green steel sites. They're securing demand. They're commercializing. We've got decarbonisation pathways. We've got buyers and investors and standards taking action, great civil society partners. And the big policy shifts in the US and EU have sort of answered the question whether change will come. I think everyone knows now it will. Don't quite know yet how. But on the negative side, there's a huge ambition gap. I'm really surprised by this figure, that 70% of primary steel production is not yet covered by any net zero company commitment. I'm not aware of other sectors where it's that bad. And then even when there are commitments, they may be in the 2040s, net zero by 2050 is too late, and there's very little implementation, there's very little in terms of specific timelines and delivery. There's greenwashing in the sector. Oh, we're green because we're reducing emissions by 10%. Well, when the sector's emitting 7% of annual global emissions a year, that's not enough. There's political influence being used to block policy change rather than drive renewable energy. And these market signals that are happening are just happening too slowly. So that's the second reason we exist. Change is happening, but too slow. And the third reason we exist is we bring complementary voice and additional tools to the change-making space. We don't think there's enough pressure for change. We believe that driving change needs allies working with industry, such as on standards, and those challenging industry, calling out the gaps. And steel decarbonisation is a national play. Hey, I'm from the UK. I know all about national identity in steel, but it's an internationally traded commodity, and we need national, international drivers of change. And finally, we also think the boundaries of the conversation need to change. There's a lot of talk about what's feasible, what's commercial. Of course, that is important, but we also need to talk about what does the planet need and what enables a stable and indeed survivable planet. And there's an element of ambition and innovation and reach and stretch that just has got to be added to this conversation. So those are the three reasons we exist. So what? What do we do? Well, our initial analysis shows us that coal-based steel production amounts or causes 90% of the emissions of the steel sector. So the first place to start is coal-based steel. And at that point, I will hand over to Margaret to tell you more why we think coal is the culprit and what to do about it.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Caroline, for setting up the conversation. As Caroline mentioned, a lot of our initial report focuses on coal as the culprit, as really the driver of climate emissions. And so we're going to go into that. Next slide, please. Very good. So the primary way of making steel, primary steel production, virgin production, with the blast furnace basic oxygen production process, uses about 770 kilograms of met coal per ton of steel, which is a lot. If you're not within the steel industry or are still getting used to it, the term metallurgical coal, also known as coking coal, different quality than thermal coal. But globally, that coal accounts for about 23% of annual global coal output. That's super significant. So when we've been talking about for the last decade or more about essentially getting coal and fossil fuels generally out of the power sector, we've essentially kind of left out a quarter of that problem, which is just kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Next slide, please. So we tried to, particularly for folks who are new to the steel sector, break down steelmaking in as basic a way as we can in a 5-step process, certainly building on some of the examples from some of our friends in this area. So step 1, the actual mining of the materials, so coal and iron ore mining, and step 2, the iron making the fuel preparation, where you're preparing for the iron making. Step 3 is the iron making, which happens in blast furnace, and this is what a lot of folks really kind of conjure up when they're thinking about steel making. Step 4 is actually turning that iron into steel. And then step 5 is kind of the finishing. So actually kind of shaping it, rolling, casting it, turning it into these giant coils or flats that are traded and turned into eventually finished products. So when you think about these steps, not everybody kind of knows kind of where the emissions lie in this process. And so I'd like to turn to the next slide, which provides a bit of a breakdown of kind of the ballpark and averages of where a lot of the emissions are coming from, and where a lot of the emissions are being driven by coal. So actually at the mining site, and this is something that's kind of been come to light the last few years, which is at a lot of these mine sites, there actually is a significant amount of methane released. And so that really adds to the kind of the total that of emissions that coal is driving. And then, of course, step 3 is where you see the most of the emissions. So that's where you're seeing the majority of emissions from coal-based steelmaking. But there's smaller bits in fuel preparation and in the steelmaking process as well that add to that total. But it's really that blast furnace where most of the emissions are coming from. But the mining also adds a significant amount as well. And so the result of that is that essentially this coal-based steel production drives about 3.2 tons of CO2 per ton of liquid steel. And so super significant when you add in, again, the mining side of that. Next slide, please. So as we've probably learned, if you've been paying attention again from the power sector, is that coal isn't just a problem from a climate emission standpoint, a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, but it also has a lot of other downsides. So the impacts of air pollution, water pollution, local health impacts, the nearer you are to those sites, into any emissions from that. And so when we think about the local impacts of coal-based steelmaking, we also have to think of it through those lenses as well. So I live here in Chicago, and if I look south towards Northwest Indiana on the other side of the lake, you can see the Burns Harbor facility right there, as well as some others. And so, those have been longstanding and big impacts. And actually, Hilary, one of our panelists, enlightened me to this fact, is that we'll talk about relinings in just a moment. But if Burns Harbor goes through with their relining, you're looking at enough both pollution, air, and climate emissions from that facility that's about equivalent to an average thermal coal plant. So we really are kind of, when we start talking about coal, starting to compare apples to apples when we talk about local impacts and global impacts. Next slide, please. So the majority, and most folks know this who are versed in the steel industry, but not everybody knows this who's new to it. The majority of global steel is produced through coal-based production, just like we described, that 5-step process. And about 71% of steel globally is made that way. And then the other, about 28% approximately, is made through electric arc furnaces, where we're melting large amounts of scrap steel, metal, and then with high amounts of electricity and refabricating recycled steel. But 71%, of course, still that primary steel making. But these are kind of inversed and reversed and look different by region. So here in North America, we're talking about kind of an inverse of that. Those numbers were about 70% is made through electric arc furnaces and about 30% with primary production with the traditional BF BOF process as a common acronym that you'll see around. And then in Europe, it's roughly half and half. So about 48% EAF, 51% primary. And then in Asia, because a lot of the growth in recent decades has come from that region, we've seen a lot more primary production or BF BOF process there, so about 81%, and only about 18% coming from EAFs. And so as the decades move forward, we're going to start to see some of these numbers continue to shift as well, and hopefully move more into EAFs, but that can't be the total solution, as we'll get into. Next slide. So looking down kind of the horizon here, starting to kind of put our arms around this issue. The reality is actually, we can start to put our arms around the kind of the universe of facilities that we're talking about where this coal-based steel is produced. And so just over 1,023 blast furnaces in operation around the world. And so, you can definitely count those up and break those down by country and company and region, and it becomes a little bit more of an approachable problem. The other issue I'll draw your attention to here is there are a number of announced or projects in construction. The majority of those are still in Asia. So as we've seen the growth, we're still seeing new projects come online. And so that's something that we want to be really keenly aware of where those new projects are announced, and whether or not, as we get closer to kind of important thresholds, which we'll outline around climate, those new projects or projects in a pipeline are really going to test the limits of kind of our planetary boundaries, and certainly steel's emissions as well. Next slide. So one of the other things that we've been trying to outline with some of our work is really setting steel up as kind of, posing a real grave and imminent danger in terms of its climate impacts. So next slide, please. In terms of the potential to continue to lock in this coal-based steel production. So every 25 to 15 years, blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace process, they require some refurbishment, reinvestment in the actual infrastructure of the furnace, due to wear and tear and things like that. And so every 15 to 20 years, companies will make a decision about a particular furnace to either reinvest or begin to transition into different technologies. And so these are called relinings. And so in the next 6 to 7 years, we started to look at kind of what facilities, what furnaces may come up for relining. And so one example of that, as we've talked about, is the Cleveland-Cliffs facility in Burns Harbor. And they just announced that they're planning to reline that by 2025. And so that's kind of one of the first near-term examples that we've had of a company essentially kind of doubling down on this coal-based steel production and potentially locking in another 15 to 25 years of what is a very polluting process. Next slide, please. All right. So as I talked about just a moment ago, we are looking kind of at the existing universe, that 1,000 plus number of facilities owned just by a couple of hundred companies, and thinking through what will come up for realignment. So if we break this down by region, we certainly see a lot of realignment decisions coming up in Asia, but every region has kind of this red here, which is in the next 4 to 5 years, a decision around whether to reline a particular furnace or set of furnaces. And if we extend it to the orange, we're talking about 26 to 2030, and even more furnaces are going to come up for the question of whether or not to reline them. So these are incredibly critical decisions. Essentially, are we going to lock in more pollution or not? And if you use those dollars and potentially other dollars differently, you could set a different course for steelmaking altogether, company by company, facility by facility. And so, another reason to underscore why SteelWatch has come into existence is essentially the next 6.5 years will make or break from steel's perspective, and certainly more broadly, our ability to keep the planet on a 1.5 degree pathway. And so these couple hundred decisions ultimately will be absolutely critical. Next slide, please. So it's a choice. We're making decisions every day. Cleveland-Cliffs has said that they want to reline one of the furnaces at Burns Harbor. Other companies in the last few years have decided, ArcelorMittal at the Ghent facility in Belgium. These are recent decisions that they've decided to lock in these highly polluting coal-based steel production. But we also have kind of a shrinking carbon budget. And so if we continue on this path of relining, we're just going to keep gobbling up that carbon budget. And so these decisions made by, like we said, just a few hundred companies, I think 365 companies making these investment decisions, will they continue on the path that they've set out, or will they begin to transition facilities towards cleaner production overall? Next slide, please. So that's why we are calling for a sunset for coal and steel production. This is something that's been done on the power sector side of things for a number of years, really thinking through and doing the hard math of what it requires to keep a livable planet, and how that translates to decisions we make in real time. And so our fundamental calls to action are no investment in any new or realigned coal-based blast furnace facilities within the OECD countries or by companies headquartered in OECD. And so, we really certainly extend that to companies who operate globally, but are headquartered in particular places. And then secondly, no investment in relining existing or building new coal-based blast furnace facilities that go online from starting essentially end of 2027, very beginning of 2028 in emerging economies. And so, we've seen some other reports, and Dr. Kathy Reimann is going to talk about Agora's report shortly. But we're really drawing firm lines in the sand here, and I think what some of the other technical experts have come to the conclusion is that actually, this is possible, that we are seeing new cleaner technologies emerge, and that it's becoming more and more feasible and certainly necessary. Next slide, please. So we wanted to kind of frame up in our report a few of the things that we think are really critical enabling factors to ensure that we can maintain a 1.5 degree pathway for steel and get rid of coal in steelmaking generally. And so just kind of things that we'll kind of keep our eye on, but we also know a lot of others are working on these things to help unlock this this problem. So large scale clean electricity for green hydrogen and overall electrification economy wide, but certainly within steel. One of the other critical things that we want to avoid, and I think a lot of others are focusing on this, is avoid gas lock-in. That right now we want we're moving towards GRI-based production, which is a good move. But we also want to ensure that hydrogen ready really does mean green hydrogen ready on a specific timetable. And that's going to require a lot of scrutiny and a lot of clean electricity. Worker protections. This is absolutely critical when we think about how much change that will take place within the steel sector, that workers who have been part of the steel industry continue to be part of the steel industry, and that we really think about transition for existing sites and regions where steelmaking has played a critical role in the economy. Environmental cleanup and remediation. A lot of these facilities certainly have left a lasting impact on communities, and those issues need to be firmly dealt with transparently and with accountability. Green buyers and investors. So Hilary will talk about this soon in her portion, but really ramping up pressure for investors and buyers of steel, particularly car companies and others who play a critical role in motivating market demand, and then certainly government support and strong enabling policy, which we're starting to see in Europe and Canada and the US and in a few other regions, but definitely needs to be a critical partner in this process. Next slide. All right, so if you remember one thing today, it is about getting rid of coal and steel, which just a few years ago probably did not seem possible, but now really it seems very, very possible, and not only possible, but absolutely essential in terms of keeping a livable planet and a thriving steel industry. So with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Caroline.
Thank you, Margaret. And yeah, indeed, that's the art. What seems impossible needs to become possible. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kathy Reimann and then Hilary Lewis, who are fantastic actors, change makers in this space, all with different roles. Kathy is the program lead at Agora Industry. And if you didn't read their 15 Insights report that came out a week or 10 days ago, I really recommend it. They have been doing fantastic research, and so we will get the benefit of that. I'm glad our report came out after yours. And after that, I suggest, Hilary, you come straight in after Kathy without coming back to me. Hilary is the steel director at Industrious Labs that's working on the future of a clean industry in the US and really looking at how industry can be competitive, but also truly clean and responsible and working for a decent future. So two fantastic allies. Thank you so much for being with us. Kathy, over to you to hear a few minutes of your reaction to the report, and then we'll have a wider discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Caroline, and also Margaret, for your presentation, for your report, and also, of course, the work that you have started at SteelWatch. I think it's vitally important to keep pushing for the steel transformation, and so thanks for inviting me today. As Caroline said, I am part of Agora Industry, which is a think tank. With the mission to develop evidence-based solutions for the transformation towards some climate neutral industry. And our work focuses on agenda setting, on combining maybe technical and political perspectives, and we always follow the fact-based approach. I myself have a background in environmental engineering, and most of my working life has been dedicated to environmental assessment, which goes beyond climate impact. So I'm especially happy to see that you also included additional environmental aspects and also societal aspects in the report. I really appreciate you breaking down the key points of the steel transformation, emphasizing the importance of coal, and also really putting a spotlight on the carbon budget and the importance of action before 2030. Sometimes it may seem that 2050 is a lot of, or there's a lot of focus on the discussion for a pathway to 2050 without really focusing on our remaining carbon budget and maybe thereby forgetting the target of 1.5 degrees. We draw similar conclusions from what we have analyzed over the past 2 years, and which, as has been mentioned, have just recently started to publish with our report, 15 Insights on the Global Steel Transformation. In the past, Agora's work on the steel sector focused a lot on Europe, where we see that many steel companies have really already announced to build low carbon steelmaking capacities. But steel is globally produced, it's traded in global supply chains, and therefore our new study takes a global view and tackles different potentials across different regions. What our study shows is that a phase out of coal in steelmaking by the early 2040s is technically feasible. But of course, technical feasibility is not all there is to it. There are several factors that are also important. For once, we need a fast rollout of clean steelmaking technologies. Hydrogen-based steelmaking has been mentioned. We also need an increase of scrap utilization. And we also need to focus on material efficiency to really support the transformation. Secondly, we always need to think about economic feasibility, which actually covers several angles, from additional costs to very different starting points and financial potentials around the globe. And it also covers investment cycles, as you showed. And just as much, we found that we need enhanced international cooperation to ensure that upcoming investments will really contribute to climate neutrality. And last, I think what we need to realize with regard to steel transformation is that CCS, the carbon capture and storage on blast furnaces, will not play an important role for the steel transformation. And we honestly need to address what this means for announced investments in new blast furnaces, which we see globally, especially maybe in Asian, Southeast Asian countries. Moving from a coal-based steelmaking, as we have today, to hydrogen-based steelmaking means that the cost of hydrogen will be a major factor for competitiveness. And those costs differ widely globally. So for many steelmakers, the way that hydrogen is produced, but also transported, will be key. And we found that a much overlooked option is transporting hydrogen in the form of green iron, which we see as a win-win really solution for both exporters and importers. On the one side, it adds value for the exporters, and on the other side, it can also ensure competitiveness for the importers in the long run. And also the Margaret just mentioned the workforce. It can also safeguard the majority of jobs domestically. Yeah, let me end by saying that I was really happy to see a quote from Agora that labeling the steel sector as hard to abate may be really outdated at this point in time, and it can in fact be fast to abate, but we need to start implementing transformation processes and technologies within the next few years. Thank you. Sorry, yeah, over to you, Hilary.
Oh, great. Hi. I wasn't sure if we were passing it back to Caroline. Caroline, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Please go ahead, Hilary. I'll come back in after you. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Hilary Lewis. I'm with Industrious Labs. We're an organization based in the US that works on transforming heavy industry. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much to SteelWatch for this great report. And we're excited to have you in the civil society advocacy environment, advocating for green steel. I wanted to start by also thanking my colleagues, John Cooney and Evan Gillespie, who contributed to the report. I, of course, didn't contribute to the report, and that's why I'm here. But let me just share some of my quick first reactions. I wanted to focus my comments today on an example that came up a couple times in Margaret's presentation. That's the Cleveland Cliffs Burns Harbor reline. But before I dive into that, Margaret also showed a slide that featured, what percentage of production comes from electric arc furnaces versus blast furnaces in different regions. And in the US, we have about 70% of our production coming from electric arc furnaces, which is great. We're a leader in recycling steel. We have a really strong supply chain to get used steel back into that circular economy. But something that I learned recently is that just that 30% of steel that is still made in blast furnaces in the US accounts for about 2/3 of the pollution from the US steel industry. I think that really highlights how significant coal-based steelmaking is when you're thinking about pollution. So even when it's a small share of production, blast furnaces can have an outsized impact on pollution. So just diving into some of the US landscape, there are just 2 companies left in the US that operate blast furnaces. Cleveland Cliffs is one, the other is US Steel, and they operate currently 14 blast furnaces because a few are idled. And as Margaret mentioned, Cleveland Cliffs recently announced that they're going to reline one of their blast furnaces at Burns Harbor in Indiana in 2025. Our calculations show that relining just this one blast furnace would release an estimated 68 million tons of CO2e over its lifetime, which is equivalent to operating a coal plant every year for about 18 years. And as we just learned, this is an unacceptable climate risk when we're thinking about our climate budget. Margaret also talked a little bit about some of the other impacts of steel, not just on our climate, but on health. I think Margaret and I had a little miscommunication here just about the equivalency between coal plants. It is very equivalent in terms of CO2e. I think it is a little bit lower in terms of some of the health harming pollutants. But when we zoom in on Burns Harbor, just looking at it regionally, Burns Harbor leads the entire state of Indiana as the single biggest industrial emitter of health harming NOx, SO2, and PM 2.5. In 2018, it was also named the largest source of industrial lead pollution in the country after emitting about 18,000 pounds of lead and 173,000 pounds of cancer-causing benzene in 2016. So the health impacts are still very real and large, and that's just one example from Burns Harbor. Burns Harbor has also been cited for other environmental harm, including discharging cyanide and ammonia nitrogen into the Little Calumet River, killing 3,000 fish, temporarily closing nearby beaches, and also closing a drinking water intake facility. So to protect our climate, our health, and our environment, we need to look at Burns Harbor again and really all these blast furnaces. Because the thing about Burns Harbor, as well as it's an important example to think about today because of the reline announcement, Burns Harbor is not unique. Many of the impacts of the Burns Harbor blast furnace are the same or similar, both regionally and globally. One thing that is different, though, about Burns Harbor is that, of course, it's in the United States. And so our policy landscape is different, if not unique. So one of the opportunities that we have here, switching gears into what we can do, is the Inflation Reduction Act and Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, which you may have heard of. These are just some of the incentive programs that we have in the United States. And so when we're thinking about incentives, one of the things that governments can do is to help bring down the cost of transitioning to cleaner alternatives. So in this recently passed legislation in the US, there's about $6.3 billion to help decarbonize heavy industry, including steel. And I think this opportunity is one where we can build in partnership with communities and workers a new investment plan, a transition plan for Burns Harbor that would make a really compelling case to apply for these federal funds and can future-proof this particular facility to green steel demand and would also reduce health and climate harming pollution. But we need not just the way, we also need the will. And so we need companies like Cleveland-Cliffs to step up and to try to take advantage of some of these opportunities. When we're thinking, Margaret also mentioned that the impacts on communities and workers. And just to dive in a little bit on the worker impacts, there was a report in the United States based on a different facility. And that report was from the Ohio River Valley Institute, and it found that actually green hydrogen, DRI, is not only good for health and the environment, but it's also good for workers. So this was based on the Edgar Thomson facility, a US steel facility in Braddock, Pennsylvania. And the study found that the transition to green hydrogen, DRI, could grow the total number of jobs supported by steelmaking in the region by 27 to 43% by 2031. I think on the flip side, it showed that in Pennsylvania in particular, jobs are on the decline. And so this is really an opportunity to transform the industry, to grow jobs, and to grow a new industry and really transform how steel is made in the United States. So the policy support for the transition to green hydrogen DRI is one of the things that we can do to put this report into action. Another is building demand. So there's a great leaderboard from the Lead the Charge network, which is a global network coordinated by the Sunrise Project. They looked at auto companies around the world and a number of different components of how vehicles are made and their climate impact, and scored the different companies. And we came out last year, and there's been a lot of progress since then. One company that I wanted to highlight is Mercedes-Benz. They've made a number of announcements recently to procure more green steel. And interestingly, they said that when they're looking at their electric vehicle production, 20% of production-related emissions actually come from the steel and EVs. So there's a big opportunity for both the auto industry and the steel industry to kind of clean up simultaneously. And the reason why the auto industry has such a big impact on the steel industry in the US in particular is that for Cleveland-Cliffs, for example, the auto industry is their biggest end market. The auto industry demands a really high grade of steel that is currently made in blast furnaces, even when so much steel in the United States is made in electric arc furnaces. And so they really have a symbiotic relationship. And if the auto industry is demanding green steel, the steel industry will really need to clean up. So that's one of the levers and opportunities that we have here, is to really make sure that companies like Mercedes and Ford and GM that have made climate commitments, that want to clean up not just their tailpipe emissions, but all of their emissions and get to net zero, are really making the commitments today to advance green steel, be able to use that in their vehicles. So I think those are just two opportunities that I want to highlight, that there's opportunities from governments. I don't think that's unique to the United States, although the specific example I gave was, and there's an opportunity to use the corporate purchasing power of buyers to make sure that green steel is available. Of course, Margaret also outlined some of the challenges and preconditions like green hydrogen availability and the risk of fossil gas. So maybe we'll get there. So maybe we'll talk about those risks and how to avoid them in the Q&A, but I think that's where I'll leave it today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary. Thank you so much, Kathy. Really interesting perspective. So we've heard from Kathy about all the elements of that phase-out pathway with the hydrogen-based clean steel, scrap, fuel efficiency, not really CCS. Hearing from Hilary is so interesting, Hilary, because I think one of our roles is to bust some of these myths or narratives that go around. And the idea that, oh, there's no demand for clean steel, we hear all the time, particularly our colleagues in Asia. But you just talked about demand from the auto industry, Mercedes-Benz stepping up. And I know that H2 Green Steel have also just done a 7-year binding agreement with ZF, who are also key in the auto industry. That demand is there. And then other people say, oh, the quality of green steel is no good. That myth is being bust. So time and again, myths are being bust. We just need to share this narrative globally and not let people stall, because it's not going to be easy, but stalling isn't going to get us out of this. So thank you both very, very much indeed. Kathy, I wondered if you would like to just say a little bit more about CCS, because I know there's a lot of companies, a lot of assumptions that we can do a blast furnace with CCS and that'll be okay. and you really cover that in your report. So perhaps just touch on that, and then we'll come to the Q&As that have been asked in the chat.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, I mean, in the past, let's say the blast furnace route plus CCS has always been put forward as some of an, maybe not the sole, but an additional solution. And currently, I think we see quite a few technical issues with that. If we look at CCS in the steel production, we see high residual emissions. Part of that is because you have, you don't have just one point where you could capture the emissions. You have a lot of emissions along the processes. So the capture rates are a lot lower than we would need for even coming close to carbon neutrality. So if we only capture 40 to maybe 70–75% of the CO2 emissions, that's nowhere near what we need if we want to have a carbon neutral pathway of 95 or even net zero emissions. In addition, I think Margaret briefly mentioned the upstream emissions. If we look at the coal mines and the methane emissions, that's on top. That's on top what we see for the steel production, but you can't ignore that if you want, or if you keep using coal, because these emissions are also there in addition. So I guess CCS may be a solution in some cases. If it makes sense, go for it. But to be honest, right now, we don't really see that it flies with any investors. We see a lot of DRI capacities announced and nowhere near as much of CCS. I think there's even just one plant in Dunkirk, which comes even close to capturing some higher CCS rates. Yeah, those are the technical issues. And then I think in addition, if we move forward in the transformation, we will have a lot more technologies which are actually carbon neutral, or at least close to it. So I think there's also an offtake risk as soon as we're starting to move to more of green lead markets. If companies like Mercedes, or also maybe companies in the area of renewable energy for like wind turbines, or also household appliances, Miele is one of them. If they go for green steel, then they're not going to accept a sort of green steel with capture rates of 60%. So there's technical issues on the path to carbon neutrality, but I think there's also really investment and offtake issues.
Thank you. Yeah, huge offtake issues, transparency, credibility, greenwashing. It's all going for you there. We are going to come to the interesting question from Auburn Bell about why is change not happening? What's the cause in ambition, particularly over in the US, Hilary, given IRA is a very powerful ambition. But let's turn first to the question from Hassan Akbulut. I hope I pronounced your name right, but I know you know a lot about this. And I think it's the question about how China, India, and other countries will follow Western countries and close the blast furnace. I think we can almost spin that question to, well, what do players in Europe and US and rich countries need to do to ensure that they are contributing to changing the global market? What I think, Margaret, we'll come to you first, because I think SteelWatch has quite a clear vision on this, and then come to the other panelists, and then after that, Hilary will come on the question of the what's stopping sufficient ambition. Margaret, do you want to comment on how we see the roles of different international players?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I think we outlined it a bit and hinted at it a bit, certainly in our core demands at the end of our report. That the reality is, OECD countries have a lot of responsibility here. One, to make the investments, to ensure that we can basically, get green steel at scale and commercially available widely in different regions, but also to make the investments in places where more of the steel is being made and consumed, particularly in emerging economies in Asia. And to ensure that there's a leapfrogging that happens technologically and in the economy. So I think, a little bit on timelines is certainly the question there. And I think, particularly in India, I think will be the real kind of litmus test or kind of front line of where some of those decisions will be made, because the growth there is still really happening. And I think we have also seen, at least in China, some consolidation a little bit of some smaller, less efficient facilities merging and companies merging, and some growth slowing. But I think India will be the real test case there. And I think from SteelWatch's perspective, really focusing on a certain amount of responsibility within OECD countries, but certainly we are in need of huge partnerships and huge investments in larger countries where more steel is made.
Thanks, Margaret. Kathy, Hilary, do you want to comment on the question about how dynamics in the US and Europe relate to dynamics in India, China, and other Asian countries? How do you see it? Should we start with Hilary?
Sure. Yeah, I think, one of the ways that stands out to me is that, some of these companies that are operating in the United States are global. The two companies that still own blast furnaces in the US really aren't very global. So Cleveland-Cliffs and US Steel, but we also have an ArcelorMittal facility, and that's actually a DRI. And so I think what is learned in the US can be used in other countries, and some of the costs can be brought down, as Margaret was saying. So making sure that we get really efficient in the US and understanding how to build the best green hydrogen powered DRI, or how to build MOE, I think that could all be really helpful in making sure that these technologies are more affordable and easy to scale. So I see the US as kind of a testing ground so we can afford to make some of those riskier investments.
Thanks, Hilary. Kathy, anything to add on how Europe plays internationally?
Yeah, I mean, Europe is important for imports, also from China and other Asian countries, obviously. And there's a lot of measures being put in place at the moment, starting with the European trading system, which will phase out allowances for steel in the mid-30s, and the CBAM, which is put into place. And the companies, or the Asian companies, they do see that, and they will need to react if they will still put their products on the European markets. So I think we don't know yet how this is going to play out in the end, but there is, I think, some option for pushing even beyond Europe. Also, what Hilary said, and I mean, we have a lot of ArcelorMittal facilities, and they will move in Europe. So why shouldn't they move somewhere else? I think it's going to happen. It may take more time in some regions. It may be important to really find business cases for green steel, but I think we have a chance here to move first, and then hopefully others will be in the spot to follow.
Thank you. And as Margaret says, from SteelWatch perspective, we see buyers, we see investors, we see companies doing investments in all different countries and joint ventures. There's a lot of international linkage. Also, from SteelWatch's point of view, we are heavily focused right now in Japan and South Korea. Our report comes out in Japanese and South Korean tomorrow, with all these slides in other languages as well. And I know they're not as big as production in China or growing as fast as production in India, but they're also key established countries that are really influential in the competitive market in Asia. So that's another lever of change and a real focus of change for us. Let's have the last question on this one about what's causing the gap in ambition. And we'll ask that of Hilary, because it's specifically in the US, given that there's the IRA. And I'll perhaps just sort of finish also in reply to Auburn about how we see SteelWatch stepping in on this. Hilary, why isn't there enough ambition for green steel?
If I really knew the answer to that question, we've been in a different place in our campaign. But I do have a few thoughts. So I mentioned Mercedes-Benz and their commitments, and how I saw them kind of emerging as a leader, but their commitments are really in Europe. And so really what we're seeing in terms of demand is that a lot of this demand is building up in Europe. And I think that's a great place to start. And maybe it's going to be a similar thing as I was just talking about with how, DRI technology or some of these greener technologies can start in Europe or the US and then move elsewhere. Similarly, that could happen with demand for green steel, but we are not seeing that green steel demand as strong in the United States. And I think having a stronger advanced market commitment specifically from the auto industry in the US, probably starting with Ford and GM, would make a really big difference. They have both committed to first movers, but that was very recent. It's for a very small percentage of steel. So I think increasing that ambition would have a big impact. Auburn also specifically asked about the IRA. I'm still hopeful the IRA is going to have a big impact. The funding is not at the door yet. And so when we get those actual announcements about who's going to receive the funding and what the projects are, I'm hoping that the future looks a little brighter and that we have more steel on the ground, as they say, and more investments moving forward.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, that's great. As you say, if we all knew the answer, we could perhaps get on with it on Monday morning and have our job done by Friday afternoon. But we won't have that. We know this is a marathon, but we also know we have to be sprinting pretty fast because the climate is really in a bad place. So we need to be doing stuff on Monday morning and Friday afternoon and this side of 2030 and beyond. To touch on Auburn's last question about how does SteelWatch plan to play a role, we do want to shift the idea that the only option we have are those that are available today. We see change flickering all over the place, but that change has got to be harnessed and garnered and just accelerated. Agora have a really nice quote in their report, so I'm going to pinch it from you, Kathy, which is that steel no longer has to be hard to abate. It can become fast to abate. So part of our role is to evangelize that message. I'm not sure that's the right verb, but anyway, and then also really focus on those investment decisions that Margaret outlined, because specifically less than 400 companies have got investment decisions that will affect the future of all of us. So that's where we want to work with allies, and Auburn and others, obviously we have to come back to how will we work with allies on that. I really want to thank everyone who's made this possible. As Hilary mentioned, I must thank Evan and John Cooney from Industrious Labs, who played a key part in this report right back in January, and other allies who've also really helped us with the shaping and crafting of the message. So many players into the launch of SteelWatch, what we did in New York and what we're doing today. I can't thank everyone else by name, our funders, our allies, our growing team. And on that note, I have one more request of everyone, two actually. We'll send you a link to a feedback. We're new, we're learning, we need your feedback. Please answer our very short questions in the feedback survey. And secondly, continue to engage with us, including on Twitter and LinkedIn. I think we've already shared with you the links. And on that note, I have to say a huge, huge thank you to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.